Hey guys, tonight we begin with the tragic and often overlooked story of what going to the doctor was like in 1600. So, before you get too comfortable, take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always calming and a little magical to see who's joining us from across the world just before sleep. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft, steady hum. Settle into your favorite position and let's ease gently into tonight's journey together. It begins quietly, as many things do in the 1600s. There is no suddenness in this world. No rush of ambulance, sirens, or blinking lights, only the gentle drip of rain upon wooden shingles, the creak of old floors under slippered feet, and the slow sigh of a body that begins to change. Imagine yourself in a small, dim cottage at the edge of a sleepy English village. The hearth is warm but not roaring. Candles flicker with a sleepy glow, casting soft shadows on the roughly plastered walls. Outside, the fields are muddy from a week of spring rain, and the air smells of damp earth, wool, and the faint smoke of peat inside this home. Someone is beginning to feel unwell. It doesn't arrive like a thunderclap. Instead, it tiptoes in, quietly ache behind the eyes, a strange stiffness in the neck, a heaviness in the limbs. There is no thermometer to consult, no blood test to run, just a sense, deep in the body, that something has shifted in the 1600s. People didn't speak in terms of viruses or bacteria. They spoke of humors, the four great forces that governed health: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness, it was thought, was a matter of imbalance. Too much heat, too much moisture, a cold stomach, a melancholic liver, a choleric temperament. A flush in the cheeks might mean an excess of blood, what they called sanguine, a pale, sleepy expression. Perhaps the phlegm had risen too high. There was a gentle poetry to these beliefs, even if they were often wrong. People didn't just say, "I'm sick." They said, "I have been overtaken by a dampness in the chest," or "the bile has grown hot in me." And so, from the very first stirrings of discomfort, they reached for meaning in metaphor, in sensation, in symbols passed down from generations. In the quiet hours of morning, when the cockerel still slept and the village was wrapped in mist, one might wake with a start, not from pain, but from a strange dream. Dreams too were signs. A dream of teeth falling out could mean sickness in the gums. A dream of drowning might be taken as a sign that the lungs were filling. The sickbed was as much a place of imagination as it was of reality. But how did they know it was time to summon help? For most, it was when the rhythm of life began to falter, when milking the cow became too exhausting, when walking to the market took twice as long, when the bread burned in the oven because the mind wandered. The signs were subtle, quiet interruptions to the ordinary day. Sometimes, neighbors would notice before the sufferer did. "You've gone pale," they might say, or "You've a strange look in your eye." The watchfulness of a village was often the first diagnostic tool. Eyes that had seen plague and fever and bad air. Eyes that had learned, from hard years, how to spot the signs of something lurking beneath the skin. Children fell ill often, but their illnesses were treated with particular reverence. A child who became quiet was a worry. A child who stopped playing was reason to worry further. Adults, too, knew that silence could be more dangerous than moans, for in a world with few cures, the quiet patient was sometimes the one slipping away. And so it would begin. A person feeling off, a family watching, a village murmuring, not in panic, but in that soft way people do when they fear what they don't understand, with candlelit glances, with shared herbs, with whispered prayers. They would wait at first. Not everything needed a doctor. Some ailments could be solved at home, with poultices and rest, with mulled wine and herbs gathered from the garden, elderflower for fever, chamomile for restlessness, wormwood for a troubled stomach. The local women, especially the older ones, often held this knowledge close, passed down not in books but in quiet conversations over spinning wheels and bread ovens. Still, if things worsened, if the fever didn't break, if the cough turned thick, if the skin went yellow or the limbs began to tremble, they would send for the doctor, or the barber surgeon, or the apothecary, or perhaps just the old woman in the woods who knew about roots and poultices and whispered spells in the 1600s. Knowing you were ill was only the first chapter. What came next depended on your station, your wealth, your location, and your beliefs. But all began the same wind silence, in shadows, in the soft suspicion that something inside you had turned against you, and so you lay back in your straw-filled mattress, watching the flicker of firelight on the rafters above, listening to the gentle hum of night insects outside the window. The world continues, slow and serene, as you drift into a half-sleep of fever and worry, knowing that soon someone will come. Someone will knock at your door. Someone will look at your face and say, softly, "You are not well." But for now, you wait, wrapped in wool, breathing slow, listening to the stillness. The sickroom of the 1600s was not what we might picture today. There was no sterile whiteness, no beeping machines or soft hospital gowns. It was instead a room of familiarity, of warmth and clutter, of family voices and candlelight shadows stretching across plastered walls. It was a room filled with smells, some comforting, like lavender or boiled broth, others strange and sharp, like vinegar or crushed garlic. If you were ill, you did not go to a hospital, not unless you were desperately poor and had no one to care for you. Hospitals were grim places in those days, more akin to almshouses or places of final resort. Most people, especially those of means, remained at home, surrounded by what comforts they had, cared for by those who knew them. A typical sickroom might be a bedroom or simply a corner of the main living space. The bed was likely stuffed with straw or wool, perhaps with a feather pillow if you were lucky. Woolen blankets were drawn tight, and sometimes an extra quilt or animal pelt was laid on top to chase away the chill that clung stubbornly to stone walls and drafty windows. A chamber pot sat close by, humble, necessary, and often tended by a spouse, a child, or a servant. There was no plumbing, only the care and patience of those willing to empty it. The rhythm of life in this room was slow and circular. Morning arrived with the crackling of kindling and the strike of flint. Someone brought broth in a pewter bowl, its warmth a small mercy. Food was not expected to heal, was only to nourish the strength left behind by whatever illness had taken hold. Bread softened in milk, porridge if oats were plentiful, a little meat, perhaps, but not often. Drinking was a ritual of its own. Warm water infused with herbs, or perhaps ale watered down, or a tisane of rose hips. Some believed that spirits chased away bad humors, and so a spoon of brandy or gin might be offered in the afternoon. But more often it was water steeped with plant sage, thyme, elder, mint, and then there were the scents stopped to the modern mind. A sick room might seem overwhelming in smell. Potpourri hung in linen pouches from bedposts. Slices of onion were tucked beneath the bed to absorb vapors. Vinegar was sprinkled across the floor or heated in pans to cleanse the air. The belief was simple. Bad smells cause disease, and so good smells herbal, sharp. Clean might drive them out. Windows, if there were any, were sometimes left ajar, even in the cold. Fresh air was thought by some to be essential, by others, deeply dangerous. The air, after all, might carry miasmas, those invisible, malicious breezes that slipped through gaps and poisoned the lungs. Visitors came quietly. Neighbors entered with care, speaking in hushed tones, bringing baskets of dried flowers, small loaves, or jars of salve. They did not stay long, just long enough to offer a prayer or a piece of gossip, long enough to place a warm hand on the patient's arm and say, "You look stronger today," whether or not it was true. Children peered in through doorways, eyes wide. Illness was strange to them, familiar and frightening all at once. They had seen it before, but each time it returned with a different face. Some were kept away entirely, shielded from the fever or the sight of pale skin. Others were asked to help, to fetch water or stir a poultice, learning the rituals of care not from books, but from practice. And the patient drifted in and out of sleep. Time passed in strange ways. The line between waking and dreaming blurred. There were prayers whispered in the night, and mutterings of half-remembered songs. The mind wandered, especially in the presence of fever. Sleep was not always peaceful. The beds were not soft. The rooms were not quiet. The sounds of life continued outside: the lowing of cattle, the clatter of pots, the wind through trees. But somehow, in the softness of ritual and repetition, a kind of calm settled. One of the most constant figures in the sick room was not the doctor, but the caretaker. Often a wife or mother, a sister or daughter. Someone who sat patiently by the bedside, wiping the brow with a cool cloth, checking the pulse not by watch, but by feel. They read psalms or hummed lullabies. They did not expect thanks. It was simply the way things were. Medicines were brought in, not pills, but tinctures and powders. Dried roots ground by mortar and pestle. Syrups made from elderberries and honey. Tonic wines. And sometimes, if fortune allowed, a visit from the apothecary, who might leave behind a scroll of instructions too difficult for most to read past. Instead, by word of mouth, the sick room became a world unto itself. Time slowed. The outside world faded. Only the rhythms of breath, the rituals of care, and the hope of small improvements remained. And above all, a quiet acceptance. Illness was a part of life. It was feared, yes, but not denied. It was woven into the fabric of existence. People did not pretend it would never come. They simply prepared, endured, and hoped. And as dusk returned, casting long blue shadows through the windows, someone lit a candle. The flame flickered, small and defiant. The room grew quiet once more. Another day done. Another night to pass through, and still the patient breathed. By the time the decision was made to send for a doctor, the household had usually passed through many long days and, perhaps even longer nights of tending and waiting, hoping the illness would resolve on its own. But not all ailments healed with rest and herbs, and not all fevers broke gently with time. There came a moment, a solemn, heavy moment, when someone would rise, wrap their shawl, and say quietly, "We must call the doctor." But who, exactly, was the doctor in the 1600s? It's easy now to imagine a man in a white coat with a black bag and a stethoscope. But in the 17th century, the world of medical care was a layered and shifting one. There were physicians, yes, but also barber surgeons, apothecaries, midwives, herbalists, and cunning folk. Each had their own domain, their own tools, and their own standing in the community. To call a physician the highest-ranked medical professional was a sign of both urgency and status. These men, often university-trained and fluent in Latin, held the most prestige, though they rarely performed hands-on procedures. Instead, they asked questions, observed, diagnosed, and prescribed. Their treatments leaned heavily on humoral theory, bloodletting to balance excesses, purging to clear out bad substances, and elaborate dietary adjustments based on the nature of one's temperament. A physician was expensive. He might have to be fetched from the nearest city, perhaps riding out in the rain with a servant and a satchel of neatly labeled remedies. In smaller villages, a true physician was rare, and calling one in was as much a display of social standing as it was an act of desperation. More often, families turned to the apothecary. A man of practical knowledge, he was part chemist, part herbalist, and part community sage. He sold powders and oils, made syrups and bombs, and knew how to blend a tincture of poppy with a touch of chamomile to quiet a racing heart. While less elite than the physician, the apothecary was often more accessibly, more willing to come quickly. Then there was the barber surgeon, a man whose title seems strange to us now. Yet in the 1600s he was essential, recognizable by the striped pole that still bears his legacy today. He was the one to call for bleeding, for pulling teeth, for lancing boils and setting bones. He carried sharp knives and blood-stained rags, and while he was not often seen as a scholar, he was trusted for his practical skill and steady hand. Some villages had all three, others had none. In those cases, people turned to the wise woman, or the cunning man locals with deep knowledge of herbs, charms, and traditions. These figures operated on the edge of medicine and magic. They treated wounds with yarrow and milk thistle, cured coughs with foxglove tea, sometimes too much, and whispered old words over burning sage to drive out what could not be seen. The line between healer and heretic was thin in these days. A midwife who delivered too many healthy children might be praised or feared. A man who healed with his hands might be seen as gifted or cursed. Accusations of witchcraft could shadow those who healed too well without explanation. But when someone you loved was sick, these fears faded. You called whoever you thought could help. And when the footsteps approached on the road soft or urgent, light or labored, everyone in the house grew still. The doctor was coming. Preparations began. A basin of clean water was placed nearby. A chair was set beside the bed. If it was a physician, someone might dust the room and set out the best cloths. If it was the apothecary, the household might line up their jars and show what remedies had already been tried. And if it was the barber surgeon, well, a bucket and clothes were made ready, just in case. Children were ushered out. The fire was stoked. The door was unlocked cat. And then he arrived, sometimes in a wide-brimmed hat, other times with a pouch of dried herbs dangling from his belt. He carried a stick or a cane, sometimes not for walking, but for lifting the patient's sheets from a distance. Disease was thought to travel through miasma bad errand. Many healers took care not to breathe too deeply. Some wore beaked masks, filled with sweet-smelling flowers and vinegar-soaked sponges, believing these would protect them. Most didn't wear anything so theatrical, but all feared contagion. There was no rush in the doctor's manner. Time moved differently in these visits. He sat. He asked questions. What were the first signs? Had the patient eaten? What color was their urine? Had they had dreams? Strange thoughts? Had they been outside in damp weather? He listened to the family's stories. He looked into the patient's eyes. He pressed fingers gently against the wrist, not to find a precise heartbeat, but to feel the rhythm of life, fast, slow, skipping, steady. Sometimes he would take a cloth and press it to the tongue, examine the color, or smell the breath. Each detail told a story, and then he would speak. His voice was low and calm, and his words often veiled in metaphor. The liver is heated, he might say. The blood moves sluggishly, or a chill has taken root in the bones. There was no diagnosis in the modern sense, only interpretations, and from those interpretations he would prescribe a bleeding of 4 ounces, perhaps, a dose of wormwood wine, a poultice of comfrey root, and then, unless he was needed again soon, he would rise, take his leave, disappear down the road with the same quiet footsteps that brought him, and those left behind would get to work boiling water, measuring doses, whispering prayers, trusting that something had been set in motion, that the illness would now, somehow, be turned away. And as the candle burned low and the patient shifted gently beneath their woolen blankets, the house would once again fall silent, still waiting to see if the healing would begin. Let us open the worn leather bag. Its straps are stiff with age, the buckles rusted ever so slightly. The hinges groan as they open, revealing not rows of sterile instruments, but a curious collection of tools, each one carefully arranged, each with its own story to tell. This is the doctor's kit, the apothecary's satchel, the barber surgeon's chest. It is not sleek or shiny. It is well used, worn smooth by hands that have touched the fevered and the frightened. Inside there is no stethoscope, no thermometer, no syringes of plastic and glass. Instead, there is iron and wood, brass and bone, linen and leather. Objects that speak of a different age of time when healing was both craft and mystery. First, the bleeding bowl, shallow and made of pewter or ceramic. Its curved rim is designed to rest against the patient's arm. It is smooth, dark, sometimes engraved with floral patterns or initials. This bowl will catch the blood let from the vein, a ritual as routine in 1600 as taking a temperature might be today. Bloodletting was seen as the great rebound. Whether you had a fever or a cough, whether you were too pale or too flushed, blood was often the first to go. Beside the bowl lies the phlegma, small, folding blade with a short, sharp edge. Some were shaped like tiny knives, others resembled thick metal needles. The phlegm would be pressed gently, then swiftly into the skin, usually at the elbow or the neck. A precise cut, enough to draw a stream of blood, warm and dark, trickling into the bowl. The patient was often seated, calm, holding still, sometimes with eyes closed, sometimes murmuring a prayer. There is something quiet about the act, ritualistic, the cloth laid carefully beneath the arm, the bowl held just so, the blade wiped clean, the flow measured not in milliliters, but in instinct. The healer watched for signs: color in the cheeks, slackening of the muscles, a loosening in the breath. Next, the cupping glasses, these small glass domes, rounded and smooth, were heated with flame and pressed quickly to the skin, often the back or shoulders. As they cooled, they created suction, drawing the skin up into the cup, pulling blood and, some believed, bad humors closer to the surface. A red, puckered mark was left behind, sometimes circular bruises, sometimes small incisions made beforehand to allow the blood to flow freely into the cup. This was called wet cupping. For many, it brought relief, or at least it brought a sense that something had been done. And then the urine flask, perhaps the most curious of the tools. A clear glass bottle, often shaped like a pear or a teardrop. Into it, the healer would pour a sample of the patient's urine, holding it up to the light, swirling it gently. The color, clarity, smell, and even the presence of bubbles were red, like omens. Was it golden and clear, cloudy and dark? Did it smell sweet or sour? This was not superstition, was diagnostic tradition, handed down for centuries. The uroscopy chart, still tucked into many a physician's bag, offered a rainbow of interpretations. Among the bottles and blades were also bundles of dried herbs, carefully tied with twine. Lavender for calming, mint for digestion, for fever. Some were steeped into teas, others burned like incense to purify the air. Still others were packed into linen sachets and tucked under pillows or against the chest. The smell of a sick room was a mixture of these things: earthy, sweet, bitter, acrid. The herbal mortar and pestle was heavy and well used. Brass or stone, cool to the touch. It sat on the table like a sacred object. Within it, dried roots were crushed, barks ground down to powder, seeds broken open to release oils. The sound of grinding was slow and steady, a quiet rhythm like a drum beat in the background of a household in healing. Near it, perhaps a small book bound in leather, pages yellowed and smudged with ink and fingerprint, a handwritten collection of remedies and observations for a cough that lingers. One entry might begin, or to quiet the blood when it rushes to the head. Recipes and proportions followed, written with care. These were not mass-produced texts, but personal tomes, passed between healers, copied by hand, marked with little symbols and smudges of wormwood. There were plasters and poultices, two soft moist mixtures spread onto cloth and applied to the skin. They warmed aching joints or drew infection from wounds. Made of bread and milk, or mashed onion, or boiled comfrey root, they were simple but trusted. Time was a key ingredient. Time, and the faith that warmth could coax sickness from the body. In some kits, there might be a small mirror, not for vanity, but for checking the tongue or reflecting light into the mouth. There might also be tweezers, probes, and hooks for removing splinters or inspecting boils. These tools were cleaned not with alcohol, but with boiling water, or wiped with vinegar, or simply left in the sun. And finally, the amulets and charms. Not every healer used them, but many did. A dried toad's leg in a pouch, a piece of coral on a string, a small silver cross. Objects believed to guard against spirits or to strengthen the body's will to survive. These, too, had their place in the bag or in the patient's hand, together. All these items created a strange harmony, a balance of science and superstition, of theory and touch, of logic and love. The healer's bag was not just a collection of tools, it was a symbol of hope, of action, of presence. And when the tools were laid out, and the candles burned low, and the house held its breath, the ritual of healing could begin. A bowl here, a cloth there, the scrape of metal, the hush of warm breath. the room filled not with noise, but with the soft, slow rhythm of care. And so the night stretched on, and the healer sat quietly, waiting for the dawn. In the quiet hush of the 1600s, where cobblestone streets curved gently past half-timbered houses, the idea of the doctor was never just one figure. It was a tapestry of roles, each thread stitched with tradition, duty, and the customs of centuries. Each title carried its own place in the village, its own kind of respect or suspicion. And when someone fell ill, knowing who to call was as important as when dot. Let us walk slowly through these figures. First, the physician. He was a man of letters, usually trained at a university. His speech laced with Latin, his robes dark and long. Physicians studied Galen and Hippocrates, read scrolls on humors and temperaments, and believed deeply in the balance of nature within the body. Their tools were words and theory, observation and classification. They touched little. They prescribed much. A physician did not usually carry blades or perform surgeries. That was below his station. Instead, he examined the patient from a distance. He asked questions. He pondered. He traced the arc of illness through the logic of imbalance. Too much blood, too little bile, a damp liver, a dry heart. He would scribble instructions, often incomprehensible to the family, and hand them off to be filled by another. Physicians were expensive. They served those who could afford to summon them. A merchant's family, perhaps. A magistrate, a wealthy landowner. For the common farmer or cobbler, the physician was a figure of rumor, man seen rarely, spoken of often. And then there was the barber surgeon. His hands were rougher, his apron often stained. He might cut your hair in the morning and lance a boil in the afternoon. He was not trained in universities, but in apprenticeships. He learned by watching, by doing, by bleeding 100 arms and pulling 100 teeth. His pride was in his skill. His scars were his credentials. Barber surgeons carried knives and needles. They performed bloodletting and cupping, amputations and bone settings. They closed wounds with thread and soot, burned away infection with heated irons, and removed bits of broken arrow or splintered bone from injured limbs. It was not delicate work, but it was vital in cities. Barber surgeons had guilds. In villages, they had reputations. They were often the first called in times of trauma. A man fell from a cart, or a child cut her hand, or a birth went badly. Their tools were sharp. Their presence, both feared and welcomed. Next, we turned to the apothecary, a man of bottles and mortar, of roots and resins, of powders that turned water cloudy and oils that scented the air. He was part chemist, part herbalist, part advisor. His shop smelled of earth and spice. His shelves were crowded with glass jars, wooden drawers. Bundles of drying herbs hung from the beams. The apothecary did not cut or diagnose. He listened, he asked, he mixed. When a physician's scroll arrived, it was he who prepared the remedy. But often, people came to him directly. My mother coughs at night, they might say. My child will not sleep. And the apothecary would nod, reach for his scales, grind dried licorice or steep poppy in wine, and hand over a small corked bottle with careful instructions. He was both merchant and healer. He knew which roots were in season. He understood which combinations might harm more than help. He wrote down his mixtures in a ledger, passed down from teacher to apprentice, and he guarded his secrets closely. The three figures, barber surgeon and apothecary, were not equals, though they sometimes worked together. A physician might consult with an apothecary, A surgeon might ask for a calming draught, but tension simmered beneath the surface. Physicians looked down upon barbers. Barbers resented the physician's distance. Apothecaries walked a careful line, needed by both, but respected by neither. And beyond them, still stood the midwife and the wise woman. These were not official titles in the eyes of institutions, but they carried immense weight in their lives. Of ordinary people, a midwife was trusted with life at its most fragile. She had seen more births than most physicians. She knew the signs of trouble, the feel of a breech baby, the way to press here or whisper there to coax life into the world. Her hands were steady, her voice calm. She was often the one who stayed long after the men had gone. The wise woman's called a healer. Sometimes a cunning woman held a different kind of power. She knew herbs, yes, but also charms. She spoke of dreams and omens. She read the patterns of moles on the skin, the way a fire cracked, the pull of the moon. She was consulted quietly, respected openly, feared in whispers. Sometimes these women were accused of witchcraft, especially if their patients recovered too quickly. But most villagers protected their own, for when a child coughed through the night or a wound festered, it was not the physician who came at midnight, it was the old woman with the bundle of rosemary and the strange little pouch of stones. All of these figures existed together, not always in harmony, but always in need. And when the illness was serious, when fever clung to the skin like damp linen, or when a shadow spread beneath the eyes, families would debate in low voices. Shall we send for the physician? Perhaps the apothecary will have something. The barber could bleed her again. The wise woman cured our neighbor's child. It was not just a matter of belief. It was a matter of access, of coin, of time. And so the wheel turned. Roles rotated. Remedies were tried. Titles mattered, but not as much as trust. A man could have 10 degrees and still be less useful than the midwife who'd seen 100 births. A surgeon could own a dozen blades, but no less about healing than the grandmother with ash leaves and honey hidden in her apron. In the end, what mattered most was presence. The warm hand, the steady voice, the willingness to stay. For in that quiet world, beneath the heavy eaves of wood-beamed cottages, healing was not just science. It was ritual, it was care. It was choosing the right person to step through the door and say, "I'm here now. Let's begin." The body was a garden, they said, a delicate system of humors and balances, of heat and moisture, of wind and bile and blood. When it faltered, it had to be tended, weeded, watered, warmed, cooled. And so, when someone fell ill in the year 1600, what the doctor or healer or apothecary gave them was not a simple prescription. It was a ceremony of substances, a philosophy in physical form. Let us open the cupboard of remedies now, ever so gently. The light is dim, the shelves uneven, the jars dusted in age. Each container holds something strange, something hopeful, something powerful, or, sometimes, something dreadful. Begin with the simplest, the herbal teas, warm and fragrant. They were the first comfort offered to a patient too weak to rise. A tisane of chamomile to calm a racing heart, a brew of mint and fennel to soothe a cramping belly, elderflower for fever, thyme for the lungs, sometimes sweetened with honey, sometimes left bitter, depending on the nature of the illness. Herbs were known by touch and taste and story, passed from one hand to another, from midwife to mother to daughter. A deeper sickness called for a deeper cure. Now come the purgative substances meant to clear the body from within. The belief was that illness often stemmed from something trapped, stagnant, poisonous, a sluggish liver, a clogged bowel. The solution, a purge senna leaves boiled into a tea, could loosen the bowels. So could rhubarb root, sometimes even mercury. Compounds were used, harsh and toxic, but believed to be effective. The patient would drink, then wait. A long day might follow, of discomfort and weakness. But afterward, it was thought, the body had been cleansed. The sickness released next, the emetics to make one vomit, a dose of ipecacuanha root, or sometimes even salt water, was used to expel what was believed to be corruption in the stomach. This was not done lightly, but if the patient had eaten something bad, or complained of tightness in the chest, or suffered a mysterious internal heaviness, an emetic might be prescribed. Once again, the theory was, what's inside must come out. And then, the most revered of all treatments, bleeding. As we have already seen, bleeding was more than a medical intervention. It was a belief, almost a sacrament. The drawing of blood, either by lancet, leech, or cupping glass, was thought to bring balance. If the cheeks were too red, if the mind was restless, if the pulse was bounding out, came the bowl. Leeches were sometimes used for those deemed delicate, children, the elderly, the weak. Smooth, cold, and almost gentle, they were placed on the skin and allowed to drink slowly. When full, they dropped off on their own. The blood flowed, and with it, many believed, the illness ebbed. But there were subtler remedies, too. Syrups and tonics, made with care, were the domain of the apothecary. A syrup of licorice root for a harsh cough, a tonic of rosemary and white wine for sluggish blood, elixirs of violet and honey to cool a fevered throat. These were given by the spoonful, often several times a day. Some were sweet, some were bitter. Some were gently warming, others bracingly cold. Possets were another common comfort warm drinks, made of milk curdled with ale or wine, thickened with bread or oats, spiced with nutmeg, cinnamon, or ginger. They were used to soothe, to nourish, to help one sleep. A sick child, fretful and warm, might be given a posset at bedtime. Held gently in the crook of a mother's arm, the warm cup pressed to their lips. And let us not forget the plasters and poultices applied not to be swallowed, but to be felt. A mustard plaster on the chest to draw out phlegm, a bread and milk poultice for swelling, a compress of vinegar and rosewater placed across the forehead to ease a burning mind. The application was slow, careful, often repeated through the day, changed as it cooled. The touch itself was part of the cure. There were stranger cures, still, a spoonful of powdered horn, a drop of oil from a mummified body, powdered toad, dried viper. Remedies that came not from the garden, but from the deep corners of old books and darker traditions. These were rarer, used when hope ran thin. Still, they were believed in. One popular treatment for fever, a piece of parchment inscribed with a sacred verse or magical phrase worn around the neck or sewn into the patient's pillow. These charm cures may not have altered the body, but they soothed the mind. And in those quiet nights when fever made shadows dance, belief could be as powerful as any draught. Another curious practice was the transference of illness, an attempt to draw sickness from the body and into another object. An egg might be rolled over the patient's chest, then buried at a crossroads. A live chicken might be placed at the feet. A metal rod rubbed across the skin, then plunged into cold water. These acts were symbolic. Yes, but symbols held great power in a world where so much was unknown, and yet For all these varied cures, one of the most important treatments was the simplest time. Rest, warmth, to lay still, to be washed gently, with cloth and warm water, to sleep, wrapped in wool and candlelight, to be watched over by someone who whispered softly, who smoothed the brow, who said nothing but stayed. This was not a medicine one could measure, but it was often the most effective of all. For healing, in 1600, was a delicate dance between body and belief, between herb and prayer, between fever and the flickering hope that tomorrow might be better. And as the last draught was given, and the poultice replaced, and the patient's eyes finally closed in a fitful, murmuring sleep, the house would grow quiet again, still waiting, and the remedies, lined up on the table, mysterious and earthy and strange, would stand guard through the night. Picture, if you will, a room not unlike many others, space of wood and stone, warmed by a fire that crackles softly in the hearth. The shutters are drawn against the wind, the candlelight flickers against rough-hewn beams, and the air is thick with the scent of herbs, hot broth, and the faint iron tank of blood. This, dear listener, is where medicine was practiced in the 1600s. It is not a theatre in the modern sense, and yet there is performance here, a stage, a cast of participants, and a kind of drama that unfolds beneath the eyes of a watching household. The sick room is both sanctuary and spectacle, where the rituals of healing play out with hushed reverence, or, sometimes, in sharp cries and hurried hands. In larger towns or cities, there might be a place set aside for surgery, a back room in an apothecary's shop, or a corner of the barber's quarters fitted with a sturdy table and thick cloths. But for most people, whether noble or peasant, the treatments took place at home, in kitchens, in parlors, on the edge of a bed, wherever there was space and light and a measure of privacy. The bed, often, was the central stage. If a patient was weak with fever or injury, they were not moved. The doctor or barber worked where they lay. The mattress, stuffed with straw or feathers, was covered with a linen sheet and perhaps a woolen blanket rolled back to expose the necessary part of the body, an arm for bleeding, a leg for the chest for cupping or compress. The tools were laid out with care on a nearby table or chest, a shallow bowl, a folded cloth, a blade, perhaps a candle, 2 warm glass cups, or sterilizer hook. There was no anesthesia, no antiseptic, no sterile. Drape's cleanliness was understood in terms of freshness, not microbiology. A clean cloth was one recently boiled. A clean hand was one that had been washed in vinegar. If the treatment required standing, a sturdy chair was chosen, preferably one with arms, so the patient could grip something. A bowl was placed beneath. A cloth was draped over the shoulder. And then, in silence, the doctor prepared his instrument. There was no hum of machines, no blinking monitors, only breath. Only firelight, only the sounds of life and pain and healing, echoing quietly through wooden walls. In moments of greater urgency, the sick room could transform, becoming a battlefield, a sacred chamber, a place of intervention. If an abscess burst, if a bone fractured badly, if childbirth turned dangerous, voices would rise. Curtains might be drawn, children sent outside, extra hands called in to hold, to steady, to pray. The barber surgeon might arrive. With his case of blades, he would roll up his sleeves. He might heat a knife in the flame, or soak linen strips in wine, or reach for beeswax to seal a wound. The patient, eyes wide, would grasp at a cloth or a cross or the hand of someone they loved. And then the cut would come, swift, deep, necessary dart, There were no painkillers in the modern sense. Laudanum, made from opium, might be given beforehand if available. A strong wine might dull the edge. A cloth might be soaked in vinegar and pressed to the nose. But most patients were simply told to be brave, and they were. They bit down, they clenched, they endured, the blood flowed, the doctor moved quickly. Wounds were bound with linen strips, soaked in honey or wine or herbs. The pain did not end, but the procedure did, and with it came the hope that the body might now begin to heal. Some rooms had floor rushes, strewn with herbs like rosemary, thyme, or marjoram, not just for scent, but for the belief that they warded off disease. Others had crucifixes hung on the walls, or charms tucked into the eaves. A mother might whisper a prayer with each knot tied in a bandage. A servant might cross themselves each time they passed the sickbed. The ritual extended beyond the treatment itself. Afterwards, the cloths were burned or buried. The tools clean wiped with vinegar or boiled if there was time and fire. The bowl was emptied far from the home. The room was aired out, and silence returned. Not every treatment ended in recovery, but every treatment was an act of hope, and the sick room, whether large or small, rich or poor, was where that hope took shape in firelight, in shadow, in quiet voices and steady hands. Even when blood was spilled, even when the outcome was uncertain, it was a place where the body was trusted to speak, and where the healer, whether physician, barber, apothecary, or wise woman, listened with more than just ears. They listened with habit, with memory, with instinct, and so, in the flickering warmth of candlelight, as the patient lay resting bandaged, bound, or simply waiting, the room stilled again. The tools were packed away, the voices hushed, and the night resumed its slow rhythm. There is a hush that falls over a household when a decision is made to cut, not because it is rare, but because it is serious. In the year 1600, surgery was not an act entered into lightly. It was an ordeal, a risk, a final hope after all others had faded. And when a barber surgeon or skilled practitioner announced that the knife must be used, there was no turning back. The word surgery did not carry the quiet sterility it does today. It was an event, a spectacle, an act of both courage and necessity. There were no operating rooms as we know them. The surgery was performed wherever the patient lay, in a bed, on a bench, sometimes even on the kitchen table. But first, there was the preparation. The patient would be told gently or firmly, depending on who was doing the telling. They might nod in resignation, or tremble, or ask for a few last words alone. The family would prepare the room, laying down cloths, stoking the fire for heat and for sterilizing tools, and making sure a strong pair of arms were nearby to help restrain movement. Pain relief was minimal, if present at all. If a surgeon had access to laudanum, mixture of opium and alcohol, it might be administered, though its strength varied wildly. Wine or brandy was more common, given in large gulps until the patient grew woozy or compliant. Occasionally, herbs like henbane, belladonna, or mandrake were used, but these could be dangerous in their own right, and so, most often, the body faced the blade awake. The most common procedures involved the removal of growths or abscesses, the amputation of limbs, the lancing of infected wounds, or the draining of internal swellings. Simple by modern standards, yet monumental for the time. For instance, if a leg had turned black from gangrene after a wound or an untreated fracture, it had to be taken. Left alone, it would poison the blood and take the life. But to remove, it meant a terrible ordeal. The patient would be sat upright or laid down, depending on the location of the wound. Leather straps or strong hands held them in place. The surgeon's blade sharp, broad. Cold was set to the skin. The first cut was swift. A deep, circular incision through flesh and muscle, as clean as possible. Blood flowed freely, caught in rags or bowls, and wiped away with practiced movements. Then, using a saw, the bone was exposed and severed quickly, firmly, with a rasping sound that bit through the silence. The entire operation might take less than 2 minutes. Speed was vital, not just to reduce suffering, but to reduce shock. The longer the cut, the greater the danger. Once the limb was removed, the artery was cauterized, burned with a hot iron to stop the bleeding, or tied off with silk thread if the surgeon was more advanced. The stump was wrapped in linen soaked with wine or vinegar, and the patient, often unconscious from shock, was laid back and covered. Recovery was not guaranteed. Many died from infection, but some survived, and those who did lived as living. Proof of the surgeon's art. Another common procedure was the trepanation, the drilling of a small hole into the skull. It sounds unthinkable today, yet in the 1600s it was done with grave intention. Headaches, seizures, head injuries, these were sometimes believed to stem from pressure, bad humors trapped in the skull. A circular blade, often turned by hand, would gently wear away a section of bone until it could be lifted like a coin. No painkiller could truly dull the pain of this. But it was done with care, slowly, and sometimes with surprising success. The patient might rest afterward with a cloth of warm wine against the head, and if they lived, they were watched with reverence, as if spared by divine mercy. Bladder stones were another agony that drove patients to the knife. Men suffering from sharp, tearing pain while urinating might plead for surgical removal. The procedure involved an incision in the perineum, terribly painful, highly dangerous, and the careful extraction of the stone using forceps. No anesthetic, no antiseptic, just speed, precision, and faith. Cataract surgery, too, was attempted in some circles. A fine needle or hook was inserted into the eyes. The eye end used to push the clouded lens out of the line of vision. It didn't fix the blindness, but it sometimes allowed more light to enter, more shapes to be seen. It was delicate work, rare and deeply frightening. Yet for all these intense procedures, the 1600 surgeons still operated without fully understanding. Infection, the word germ, had not yet found its way into medical language. Tools were wiped clean, yes, but not sterilized in the modern sense. Hands were washed, but not scrubbed with soap and boiling water. As a result, many patients who survived the knife succumbed later to sepsis, or wound fever, as it was called. The smell of these surgeries was memorable. Blood, sweat, burning flesh from cauterization. Herbs hung nearby to mask the scent. Open windows let in cold air that was believed to freshen the atmosphere. Yet the air was thick with something unspoken, a weight, a seriousness, a prayer unspoken on every breath. Despite it all, there was bravery. The patient gritting their teeth, the surgeon steadying his hand, the family holding tightly. And when the final stitch was made, when the cloth was wrapped, when the blade was cleaned and set back into its box, there was silence once more, and in that silence, a kind of awe that the body could be opened and yet survive, that flesh could be broken and somehow mend. And so the patient rested, sweating, shaking, feverish perhaps, but alive, and the household watched, waiting to see whether the sunrise would bring a turning point or a farewell. There always came a moment, quiet and heavy, when the remedies had run their course, when the herbs had been brewed, the blade had been wielded, the wounds wrapped and watched, when the physician had whispered that he would return tomorrow, and the apothecary had left a final bottle behind, and still the patient did not stir, did not improve. The fever remained, the skin grew pale, the eyes dim. It was then that the family would begin to move differently, slower, gentler, with the hush of knowing they had reached the edge. For in the 1600s there were limits. Everyone knew this illness was not always a puzzle to be solved, was, at times, a mystery to be endured. And when healing no longer came from hands or herbs, the people turned inward, toward belief, toward ritual, toward the quiet company of faith. Let us step into that space. The sick room changes subtly. The instruments are packed away. The remedies still sit on the table, but they are no longer touched. Instead, a candle is lit, perhaps not for light, but for comfort. A sign that the patient is not alone, that even in darkness, something glows. A priest may be called, or a minister, or a wise woman, someone who understands the passage from one state to another, not as a surgeon, but as a shepherd. They arrive not with tools, but with words, with oil, with prayer. The anointing of the sick was a common rite in many Christian homes. A few drops of holy oil touched to the forehead and the hands. A prayer murmured over the body, not always for healing, but for peace, to prepare the soul, to comfort the watchers. The family gathers more closely now. The room is fuller than before, but quieter. Children sit wide-eyed. Grandparents whisper stories. A mother might hum a lullaby once sung long ago, its melody weaving through the candle smoke outside. Neighbors begin to stop by, not with remedies, but with bread, with blankets, with hands to hold. They speak softly, offer help, take over chores. In their silence is an understanding. The time for doctors has passed. Now comes the time for presence, and yet no one gives up entirely. The body is not abandoned. The patient is washed gently. Cloth warmed near the hearth. Hair is combed. Linens are changed. The room is freshened with herbs, lavender, rosemary, sweet bay. A window is opened slightly to let the soul breathe. This care, though simple, is profound. It says, "You are still with us. We are still here." And sometimes, just sometimes, the patient stirs, not to rise and walk, but to murmur, to open their eyes for a moment and see the faces gathered, perhaps to smile faintly, or whisper a name, or reach for a hand. These small gestures are treasures in this space. They are gifts. If the end does come, it is met not with panic, but with ritual. The moment of passing is marked by silence. A candle remains burning at the bedside. A cloth is drawn over the eyes. A prayer is spoken not in urgency, but in thanks. Thanks for the life. Thanks for the company. Thanks for the release. Some families believed that the soul lingered for a time, and so the room remained undisturbed for hours. Mirrors were covered. Clocks stopped. The body was washed and dressed in fresh linen. A sprig of rosemary might be placed in the hands, coins on the eyes, a cross at the breast, and when the time came to carry the body out, it was done with reverence. Through the front door, never. The back, feet first, so the spirit could not look back. Bells might toll, neighbors might line the path, It was not a clinical death, it was a communal one, but not all who reached the edge crossed it. Some miraculously improved. Slowly, a little more breath in the lungs, a little less heat in the brow, the return of hunger, of humor. The first time they sat up, the first sip of broth taken with their own hand. And so the room shifted once more from watchfulness to wonder. Recovery, too, was a slow and sacred act. There were no discharge papers, no lists of exercises, only time, only rest, only gentle steps toward a return to self. A walk to the garden gate, a laugh shared by the fire, a quiet morning without pain. In every household, these moments were remembered for years. They became part of the family story. When your uncle nearly died, they would say, when the priest was called, but your mother pulled through. These were tales told at tables, beside hearths, on winter nights when the wind knocked softly at the shutters. For in the 1600s, healing and dying were not opposites. They were both journeys, both sacred, both done with hands and hearts, herbs and hope, words and silence. And in the end, whether a cure came or not, the body was never left alone. There was always someone beside the bed, a candle burning, a prayer whispered, a breath shared in the dark. When the fever breaks, it does not shout. It slips away quietly, like fog retreating into the woods. One morning, the patient awakens, not in the clutches of fire and dream, but in the calm of early light. Their skin, though pale and damp, is cool. Their breath, though shallow, is steady, and in their eyes sunken and tired is the faint glimmer of returning self. The room is the same, but different. The fire still burns low, the candles still flicker, but now there is movement. A basin of clean water is brought. The window is opened a little wider. A bird is heard in the trees, and the air smells not of sickness, but of morning. This is the beginning of recovery. In the 1600s, recovering from illness was not a simple matter. It was not marked by a discharge date or a clear prognosis. It was a slow unspooling, a delicate process that required time, care, and patience. The body, once gripped by pain and fever, was now emptied, not healed entirely, but hollow. Muscles weakened, appetite gone, memory fogged. The soul itself seemed to walk softly, as if uncertain whether to re-enter the world. In this state, the patient did not rise quickly. Days, sometimes weeks, were spent in or near the bed. They were lifted gently to sit, fed with thin broth, given warm infusions of herbs known to strengthen, comfrey, nettle, dandelion root, bread soaked in milk, a spoonful of honey, an egg if one could be spared, and always company. A mother knitting nearby, a sibling reading from the Psalter, a friend recounting village gossip in a soft voice, not to entertain, but to anchor to, remind the patient that the world still turned, that life still flowed beyond the walls of the sick room. The body healed in layers. First, strength in the voice, then in the hands, then, after time, in the legs. The first steps, just across the room, were cause for celebration. Pillows were fluffed, curtains drawn open. A neighbor might stop by with flowers, or sweet cakes, or simply the gift of a shared silence. But for many, the healing never returned the body to what it had been. Illness left marks, a limp, a tremor, a cough that returned with every winter. Infections that left joints swollen or skin discolored. Mental fog that never quite cleared. These were accepted, not fought. They became part of the story. That winter, he nearly left us. They would say he has not walked the same since. And for some, there were costs far beyond the body. A month of illness could bankrupt a family. The apothecary's powders, the surgeon's visits, the cost of candles, broth, firewood. If livestock were sold to pay for care, the family's livelihood might suffer for years. If the breadwinner fell ill, the work of sewing or smithing or selling was halted. Illness, like frost, spread through the household. Sometimes, the only option was to take on debt or to ask the church for aid. Some communities provided modest relief, others turned away. Those who recovered might return to life with their heads bowed not from shame, but from weariness. They had seen the edge. They had come back changed. In other cases, the illness led to renewal. Some who survived fevers or surgeries found themselves revered. They were called blessed or favored by God. Their survival was treated as a kind of miracle. These people might walk the village with quiet dignity, touched by both pain and grace. Children stared. Neighbors nodded. Stories grew. She saw the angel, someone might whisper. He died and returned. These tales, while not always factual, gave meaning to suffering. They stitched experience into the fabric of communal memory. Still, the return to daily life was not swift. The recovering patient was often excused from hard labor for weeks. They helped in smaller ways, shelling peas, combing wool, watching the fire. Slowly, the body grew used to the weight of living again. The bones remembered how to bear it. The heart remembered how to trust it. And the mind perhaps the slowest. Men began to believe once more in tomorrow. But there was always the fear that the fever might return, that another shadow might fall. Families watched the seasons with care. The first chill wind in autumn brought memories of coughs and shivers. The heavy rains of spring carried worry of dampness and ague, and so tinctures were brewed preemptively. Herbs hung in kitchens. Garlic was braided above doorways, because to recover from illness in the 1600s was to know deeply how fragile life was, but it was also to know how precious it could be. And so the household slowly returned to rhythm. The patient took a walk in the sun, laughed at a joke, tended a plant, said grace with a little more weight in the voice. And each act, though small, was a kind of thank you to the hands that stayed, to the words that soothed, to the body that did not give up, and to the quiet mystery that, somehow, gave them back the morning. Once the fever had passed, and the patient began to stir again, there remained a silent shadow in the room, something unspoken, hovering just behind the light. For in the world of the 1600s, recovery was never attributed to herbs alone, nor to the skill of the surgeon, nor even to the resilience of the flesh. No, it was often said that something unseen had also done its part. And so, in these early, fragile days after illness, as the body knit itself quietly back together, the old beliefs stirred, the ones whispered by grandmothers at night, the ones sewn into the hems of blankets, the ones that lived, soft and enduring. At the edge of the known, the sick room became not just a place of healing, but a place of protection. To guard the recovering body, families turned to charms and signs rituals believed to keep misfortune at bay and ward off whatever spirits or forces had threatened the soul. One of the simplest was the sprig of rosemary, tucked beneath the pillow. It was believed to purify the space, to cleanse the air, to discourage evil from lingering. Rosemary for remembrance, yes, but also for strength. Its scent, sharp and woodsy, reminded the patient of life, of the garden of days before sickness. Above the bed, a garlic braid might hang dry and curling, its cloves yellow-white against dark wood. Garlic, said the old folk, was repellent to bad humors and even worse spirits. It kept the night wind from entering. Some would crush a clove and rub it on the patient's feet. Others burned it in the hearth, letting the smoke swirl through the beams like an invisible shield. At the doorframe, a horseshoe might be nailed open-end, facing up, to catch the luck. Near the window, a small bag of salt might rest on the sill, wrapped in linen. Salt, sacred and incorruptible, was believed to confuse spirits, to blind them, to stop them from finding their way in. And under the mattress, or sewn discreetly into the patient's clothing, was the charm packet. These were small pouches, no larger than a fist, made of soft leather or wool, tied with red thread. Inside, one might find a mixture of objects: a tiny cross of wood, a scrap of scripture, dried herbs, jadini, rue, a piece of silver, sometimes a tooth, or a smooth stone, or even a feather. These items were not chosen randomly. Each held meaning, specific to the family, to the village, to the healer. Who prepared it? They were protection, yes, but also memory, a link to those who had healed before. For those more deeply steeped in folk traditions, there were spoken charms verses that passed from tongue to ear, never written down. Rhymes, murmured over water before it was given to the patient. Prayers repeated in threes, while tying knots into a cord that was then wrapped around the wrist or ankle. One such rhyme might have gone: fever, fever, take thy flight, go with sun and come no night. By the moon and oak and flame, leave this house and speak no name. The words themselves were not considered magical, but the saying of them was, the rhythm, the intent, the belief. Some healers believed that a patient's shadow was weakened after illness, that part of the soul had wandered. Confused by pain and fever, it needed time to return, to settle. Until then, the patient was vulnerable, at risk of being taken again, so the mirror was covered. The name of the illness was not spoken aloud. Whistling in the room was forbidden. No animals were allowed to cross the threshold, lest they carry something unseen. These were not rules, so much as rituals, ways to make sense of the great, invisible forces that swirled around human life. Even the placement of furniture was considered. A bed should not face directly out a door. A broom should be kept upside down near the entrance. A Bible, if present, should be left open to the Psalms, its pages held down with a stone to keep it from closing on its own scene as a bad omen. And should the patient begin to dream strange, vivid dreams of water, of birds, of teeth falling, or staircases crumbling, someone would listen carefully. Dreams too were messages, sometimes from the soul, sometimes, it was said, from the dead. But not all superstitions were dark. There were joyous ones, too. The sudden visit of a robin to the window was considered a sign of recovery. The blooming of a flower outside the house, a daisy, a rose, a bluebell, meant the body was mending. A candle that burned clean and steady at the bedside meant peace was returning. Visitors, too, followed unwritten rules. They brought tokens, a coin, a ribbon, a charm of their own, not to pay the patient, but to leave behind a symbol of goodwill. And when they left, they never said goodbye directly. Instead, they might murmur, until the next good day, or the light is coming back. All of this, wrapped together, was the other side of medicine. Not the cuts or the concoctions, but the quiet rituals that surrounded the sick room, like a second layer of healing, and in truth, many patients believed it was these small things that tipped the balance. That when the fever gripped them, it was the sachet beneath their pillow that kept them tethered. That when they hovered at the edge, it was the whispered charm that pulled them gently back. Because in the world of the 1600s, the soul and the body were never fully separate. To heal one, you had to care for the other. And so, even as the broth was served, the bandages changed, the fire kept burning. Though someone, somewhere in the house, was watching the shadows, murmuring a verse, tying a charm, lighting a candle, just in case. The sun rises a little higher now. Its light creeps gently across the floorboards, chasing away the shadows that once clung tightly to the corners of the room. The fever has passed. The cough has faded. The patient, once pale and sunken, now sits quietly by the window, wrapped in a shawl, the scent of earth and spring in the breeze. It is not dramatic, not sudden. The return to life is a whisper, not a shout, but it is real. And in the 1600s, this reawakening, this slow unfolding of vitality, was more than recovery. It was transformation. For those who had passed through illness, through pain, through the edge of the known world, something had shifted. They were not quite the same. The villagers might say it plainly. She has been touched. Or, he has returned with eyes that see more. There was a quiet reverence for those who had survived great sickness. It was understood that they had learned something, even if they could not name it. Something about the body. Something about the soul. Something about the strange, thin veil that separates the living from what lies beyond. And so, those who had been ill often became keepers of wisdom, not scholars, not surgeons, but guides. People began to ask them questions. When your fever broke, what did you feel? What herbs helped you sleep? Did you dream of the river, too? Sometimes, they answered with stories. Other times, with silence. And sometimes, they became healers themselves. Perhaps not with knives or bottles, but with experience, with gentleness, with understanding. A woman who had nearly died in childbirth might begin helping other women through theirs. A man who had survived a bone break might learn to set limbs. A child who had once been ill and recovered might grow to brew teas and tend fevers with remarkable care. Healing, in this way, became generational, not taught in books, but passed hand to hand, memory to memory. This is the leaf I chewed when my stomach turned, one might say. My mother boiled this root when my brother could not sleep. The knowledge did not need proof. It had already saved lives, and the home itself changed. The bed that once held a patient now held stories. The blanket folded at the foot carried the scent of herbs, the memory of trembling nights, the feel of hands smoothing a fevered brow. Simple wooden spoon, once used to serve posset or porridge, was now a sacred object, remembered and passed down. Even the room where the sickness had lingered gained a kind of holiness. It was not feared, it was honored. Visitors who had once brought remedies now came for advice, for comfort, for company. And the one who had lain sick began to listen and nod and say, "I understand," because they did. They had walked through something most feared to name, and returned. In some cases, this gave rise to a calling. The recovering soul might begin collecting herbs, writing recipes, sitting with the dying, brewing teas, speaking gently to those caught in the first shivers of fever. They knew the path, and so they could walk it with others. Some became midwives, some became cunning folk, some simply became kind neighbors, known for their tea and patience. but all of them carried a quiet power, the knowledge of pain, and the courage of having endured it. The community recognized this, and so, when someone fell ill, they did not only call the physician or the barber, they also called the one who had known sickness, who had lived through it, who could sit by a bedside and sign with books, but with their very presence, "You will get through this, I did." This, in truth, was the greatest medicine of all. Not the sharpest blade or the strongest draught, but companionship, witness, memory. The return to life was never just for the one who had been sick. It rippled outward like warm water in a basin. It touched others, it taught others. It reminded a weary world that the body, though fragile, could heal, that the spirit, though shaken, could grow stronger. And so the days passed. The former patient planted herbs, mended clothes, laughed again, perhaps slowly, perhaps with more rest than before, but they lived. And in doing so, they became something more than they had been, not just the healed, but the healer. And on quiet nights, when a neighbor coughed, or a child's brow ran warm, or an old man dreamed of dark water, someone would knock softly at their door and ask for help, not with urgency, but with trust, because they remembered, and because the one who had once lain in shadow now lived with light. And so, in the end, the circle closed. The sick became the strong, the wounded became the watchers, and the ones who returned carried not only their breath, but a deep, still knowing that life was fragile and beautiful, and worth every slow, aching step back toward the light.